All right, let's put the argument from evil on the board a little more systematically at this point here, at the heading up here. This argument is what we call in logic reductio ad absurdum, and that is to say we reduce a position to absurdity, and so we take certain things for granted and show that those lead to various kinds of logical contradictions. So if we start off in this case here, we can say for the sake of argument that God exists. All right, let's also then take the standard conception of God, do a mainstream theological interpretation, and say that if God exists, then he has the traits and characteristics that the standard conception, at least the standard Western conceptions of God has, and so we'll argue within that framework. And those conceptions are that he's all-powerful, he's all-knowing, he's a perfectly good being, and he is the being who is the creator of the world. So then he is, and I'll just list the traits here, omnipotent, from the Latin all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, all-good, creator of the universe. All right, so then what we can do is make sure that we're clear on what we mean by each of these phrases and their implications rather for God's being the creator of the universe. And we would say something like the following, right? If God is, for example, omnipotent, that is to say, he's all-powerful, then when he is turning to create the universe, he can create any kind of universe that he wants, right? He has the power to do so. So we would say something to that effect. If God is omnipotent, then he can create any kind of universe he wants. Fair enough. If God is omniscient, what does that imply? He is all-knowing. Well, if he knows everything, he knows past, he knows present, he knows the future. He also knows, prior to the act of creation, all of the possible ways in which he could create the universe, and he knows that if he creates it this way, then here are all of the implications of that. If he creates it this way, all of the implications of that. So he has the full data set available to him, and so he is then in a knowledgeable position when he makes his creative choice, right? Then he not only can create whatever kind of universe he wants, but he knows how to create the universe he wants. Okay, that also seems fair enough. The omnibenevolent feature, God's goodness. So if God is omnibenevolent, what would that imply for God as a creator? Well, then it seems if he is perfectly good, if he's perfectly moral, if he's perfectly benevolent, and you are creating something, then you want to make something that is perfect. The best that it possibly can be, and the best that anything possibly can be, is perfect. So the implication seems to be that if God is omnibenevolent, then he would want to create a perfect world. Say by analogy to a parent, right? If a parent has brought a child forth into the world, the parent then is creating the nursery, is creating a household, is rearranging the backyard. What kind of environment do parents want to have for their children? Well, parents who are good parents, they want to create the most perfect environment that they possibly can for their children. And so on a more exalted scale, God, as an omnibenevolent being, would want to create the most perfect world that he possibly can. So if we put these then together, God could create any kind of universe he wants. He knows exactly how to create the universe that he wants, and that he would want to create a perfect world. The implication then seems to be, if God exists, he would create a perfect world. We wouldn't say that he made a mistake. Well, he doesn't make mistakes as omniscient, or that he made a mistake in execution because he has the power not to make any mistakes in the first place, or if any creep in, to correct them immediately. And he wouldn't want to make any kind of mistake, so his motivational set would be in the right direction as well, and the result then would be a perfect world. Then we bring in the obvious fact about the world. When we observe the world is not perfect. And here's where we have the contradiction. The supposition of God's existence leads to the logical conclusion that there would be a perfect world that exists, but we don't have a perfect world. This fact seems to be inescapable, the imperfection of the world, and so therefore we reach the conclusion God does not exist. All right, this is the argument from evil laid out more explicitly in detailed and logical format, and the next question is to assess its strength. Now, I want to say just a few intermediary points here about some interesting issues that have arisen in the history of Western religions particularly, and there are analog versions of this in Eastern religion as well. There are many theologians and religious people who, during the course of history, have accepted the force of this argument, have nonetheless denied that we should reach the conclusion that God exists. Instead, what they will do is say this argument is a legitimate argument, and it doesn't show that God doesn't exist, it just shows that this kind of God doesn't exist. And so what we have then is the suppositions of various sorts of non-standard kinds of gods. So one thing that we could do to continue to believe in the existence of God is to say that perhaps God is omniscient and omnibenevolent, but he's not omnipotent. Perhaps there is an equally powerful, or maybe even more powerful, other force, but it's a force of evil or a force of darkness, and there's a struggle between God as the force of good and God as a force of Satan perhaps as a force of darkness, and that's why there is evil in the world. Now that is a heretical interpretation according to mainstream theology, because mainstream theology does want to insist upon God's omnipotence, and so it can't countenance any sort of powerful being that God is not able to handle. There are some heretical versions that will deny God's omniscience. They will say that the reason why God creation contains imperfections is that God, while knowing very much, does not know everything, and so that there are some unintended consequences that are built into the structure. So God is perfectly powerful, and he can change things around, and he's perfectly benevolent, but he couldn't predict the future because the future was too open-ended, and so forth. There are also some non-standard versions that will deny God's omnibenevolence, will make the claim that God is perfectly powerful and perfectly knowing, but nonetheless, he is not perfectly benevolent. In some cases, he is angry, or he is like some other traditional pagan gods. He is more of a two-faced being. He has a good side and a bad side built into him as well. Now, the point is that all of those are logically consistent, right, with the argument as presented here. They don't force a conclusion that there is no God, but they do force a conclusion that there is a non-standard kind of God that exists. What I want to do, though, to bracket this discussion so it doesn't get too far afield, is just focus on the mainstream theological tradition in the Western tradition and see whether it's possible to maintain the standard conception of God as a perfect being in all of these dimensions, who is a creator, against the power of the argument from evil as it is laid out here.